Kevin stared at a supposedly lifeless body, ropes binding the entirety of her form to a table in dreadful ensnarement. His breathing alone was enough to send sound waves echoing throughout the blood-stained, nearly hollow room, the only source of light being a window. Her unconscious face was directed towards the ceiling, and her breathing was very light. It almost looked like her shoulders weren't rising or falling in the first place. Normally, Kevin would have thought of this to be a good thing, but that simply wasn't the case this time around. While it was true that Ruby was his enemy, he didn't want her to die quite yet. There was much more to teach, much more information that she needed to take with her into the afterlife. And so, he anxiously waited, his eyes unblinkingly plastered on her, until something of notability transpired. Her eyes started to open, unfocused, and staring at the ceiling. Her fingers and ears twitched as though she was testing the things that were still attached to her. Her eyes widened as she seemed to start recalling everything up to falling unconscious, and she started scanning the ceiling after a few minutes as she seemed more aware of her surroundings. One of the first things that she heard when she awakened was a dreadful familiar voice that made her heart sink. It was the same cheerful, murderously enthusiastic tone that she thought she had escaped from through death. "Good morning, sweetheart." The sudden sound made her flinch initially, as things had been allowed silence up to that point. But fear appeared on her face as recognition registered, and she carefully moved her neck to find the source of the voice, vision still spinning. Kevin saw the recognizable look of rising panic in her eyes, despite the dullness in them and her sickened facial expression, as though she could vomit at any moment. The physically blind man simply couldn't stop gawking at the sensation of control in his head, the power that came with being someone's tormentor. It was an uncapturable gift that he had bestowed upon himself, and for as long as he could, he would continue to take more of those gifts. "It's amazing that your mind has actually found its body again." "Even after I patched up your wounds from last time, I was starting to think that you wouldn't be able to wake up," Kevin expressed. "I wouldn't know what I would do if death took my only playmate. Oh no, trust me. You wouldn't have anything to worry about there. I would never kill you. No, I care about you too much for that. I would only bring you to your dying breath again and again. Each time the moon would rise in the sky would be the night where I would cozily lay you in your deathbed, where you would want nothing more than to truly fall asleep out of exhaustion and fatigue of all the games that we could play together. But no. You should already understand that I won't let you slip away so easily. I'll just fix you back up again, like I did now. And after I do that, like it or not, we would have to get ourselves ready to play more exciting games." The madman began to approach Ruby and started laughing lightheartedly. "Doesn't that sound like fun?" She now realized that the pain was from the wounds that he had inflicted on her when she was last awake, her heartbeat increasing rapidly. Why was she awake again? Why did she not find her way to her friend? She continued to watch him as the fog started to clear from her mind, giving her access to clearer thoughts and the ability to now understand what she was seeing and hearing. She started to tense up and tried to sit up, away from him as he approached. That was when it processed in her mind. She couldn't move. The ropes that had been tied around her were too strong for her to break, and too tight for her to wriggle out of. She was helpless prey. Kevin smiled as he observed his toy struggle in vain to break free. By this point, he made his way over to the table and walked to the side of it to examine Ruby in her fullest body length. "I can tell that you're confused, sweetheart, and that you're afraid and uncertain of what's going on. But I can assure you this much. The longer we continue our daily routine, the more you'll know exactly what will happen to you each morning you wake up." He chuckled venomously and began to walk to the edge of the table, down by her feet. She watched him while trying to figure out her surroundings. Was she in one of the labs? She continued to struggle. The monstrous man's eyes fell upon Ruby's shoe, and strangely, they had stayed there. For a time, that was the only thing that he had done. The pause seemed to have lingered for the longest while as anticipation rose in the air. Part of the woman just wanted to have him do it and get it over with, but the majority of her didn't want it to happen at all for fear that the pain would be too immense. All she could do was squirm and grunt in noises of effort as she continued to reach for the seemingly unobtainable goal: freedom. Finally, to put an end to the mentally torturing wait, Kevin spoke. "The game that I have in mind for us today will never work with this thing in the way." He grabbed a hold of her shoe and then slipped it off of her foot. He tossed it haphazardly across the room and then afterwards removed the sock that was underneath so he could randomly throw it in one of the corners. The demonic psychopath smiled in delight as he began to slide his hands up and down Ruby's exposed foot, feeling the tenderness of her flesh. "There we go. Now it's ready to play." He looked up at his victim's face. "Are you?" She gave out a familiar whimper, feeling the discomfort of the anticipation as she tried to move said foot away. A gentleman he may have been, but it was well known he had no respect for comfort zones. Kevin cackled. "Oh, would you look at you trying to squirm about and escape from my touch? It always does amuse me to see such piteous attempts of defiance against my overwhelming authority. This much is true. But you simply must hold still. It's going to make playing this game an incredibly difficult task if you don't." He let go of her foot to slip a hand into his pocket, pulling out a screwdriver and a hammer. She stared at the instruments in horror, still trying to find a weak point. The devil of a man only laughed again. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I know the perfect way to stop your foot from moving." Without another moment's hesitation, he slammed his hammer against her ankle. The sound of metal brutally colliding with bone boomed, and Ruby could hear a snapping sound to follow. She grit her teeth, but the explosive whine could still be heard. The foot stopped moving as predicted. Kevin twirled his hammer like it was a plaything, inserting the screwdriver underneath the toenail of her newly crippled foot. "Good girl." The malevolent man began to hum nonchalantly as he tapped the end of the screwdriver with a sluggish weapon, digging through the skin and impacting several of her nerves. She tried to dig her nail into her hands as much as she could in a futile attempt to cancel out the pain. She was almost wishing through her gritted teeth that they could just go back to the scalpel or knife. Another gentle push of the screwdriver, another unbearable torrent of pain to shoot through every portion of Ruby's body. There were no breaks or moments of halt. The misery just kept unfolding into more intolerable amplifications. The only comfort that the woman had was the sound of Kevin's gentle, almost loving tone as he talked over her whines in absolute torment. I know that it must hurt more than I could possibly fathom, but think of it this way. I'm just getting rid of all of that extra keratin that your body simply doesn't need. I'm doing you a big favor by removing the unnecessary parts of your body. You should be thankful that I'm doing this to you. And besides, it's not like this is all that you're going to experience throughout the entirety of our game. I've got plenty of fun activities in store for us. You have so much more to look forward to than just this. Just keep that in mind. And I'm positive that the inexplicable hell that your feet are experiencing right now will seem like something you long for in the end. Trust me, this is a good thing. She welcomed the shivering, trying to ignore how kind his voice sounded again. She tried through the chaos in her mind to find a psych, think of a plan, anything. He continued to burrow his screwdriver deeper into her toenail and let the blood from underneath stain the tip of his weapon. At last, with one final tap, her toenail split, forced into a skyward position. Warm, sticky red fluids dripped down from her toe as the flesh from underneath the target had finally been exposed. She continued to shiver and dig her nails into her palms to no avail, still gritting her teeth, once again almost willingly forgetting to breathe. Kevin smiled as he put his hammer and screwdriver back into his pocket, walking over to Ruby's side so he could meet her gaze once again. Well, I think that we've had enough of this activity. Don't worry, though. We can get right back to it in a couple of minutes. I don't have the right play toys that I need in order to keep entertaining you, and, as my guest, I simply can't allow a moment of boredom. Wait here. As though the cruel treatment of what he delivered to this poor girl hadn't even happened, he ruffled her hair and casually walked out of the room, off to get more tools to mutilate her body, more abominations of what she had understood would be her everlasting anguish. She cringed at the attempted affection. Perhaps any other day she'd have accepted that if they were on good terms, but his kindness still seemed to add insult to her injuries. She looked around the area again, still trying to find weak points in her bondings as she scanned around the room once more for anything useful. She felt her shockwaves of pain send a familiar message through her mind, and she unfurled one of her nails enough to start scratching on the table where it would be hidden by her palm. She watched the door, listening for his returning footsteps. Just as soon as she started listening, they came back in the following few seconds. I'm back, sweetheart. I found your old friend, and he won't stop talking about how beautiful your eyes were the last time he saw you. Kevin entered the room once again, a knife clenched in his hand. He says that he just can't wait to get his hands on them. She dug her nails back into her palm, hiding the marks she'd made, and frowned in confusion, before an image clicked into her head again, clearing it up instantly, causing a new layer of fear. The man's grin was frozen on his face, never leaving his features. He happily sauntered over to her, humming that same tune that he had been earlier, a song that Ruby had never heard before. The sensation of dread in the pit of her gut only deepened after the sound of each footstep, giving her all the implications that she needed to know that the distance between them was lessening by the second. When he made it in front of his unfortunate, damned soul, he touched her cheek with the tip of his blade. His knife glistened dark blue shine in the moonlight as it created a new stream of blood across her face. Only a couple of seconds into the room and it's already showing you how much it's wanted to be with you again. I can certainly see that no love was lost. How sweet. She cringed at the cold feel, but almost welcomed the pain of the blade as she continued to watch him. The scalpel hadn't done much different. The stubby weapon gently slid across more of her skin as it inched closer to her eye, where its guider wanted it to be. The direction the knife traveled in was followed by another thin line of blood. Kevin only continued to smile as it slowly progressed to the tender sphere of flesh that was firmly lodged in place where it was meant to be. Then the hollow-eyed man stopped the blade in its tracks, his smile slowly forming into a thoughtful facial expression. Wait a minute. I don't think I've explained to you why I'm doing this. I never got to my lessons of the reasons why vision can be considered evil. It's just not fair if you're unable to see the benefits of what I'm doing for you after it's already happened. Alright. I'll take some time to explain why and how being visually aware is a curse. She shivered, trying not to let the blade slip as she carefully unfurled the same finger and felt the work that she had done, starting to continue discreetly scratching. Sight is grief. Because of our awareness of what's around us, we are able to know that there are people suffering in this world. And since we've seen what suffering looks like, we know how to recognize it, and what it truly feels like to experience it. Not only that, but we understand that there are certain things that trigger our suffering from witnessing other people's involvement in it. If you had never seen someone being stabbed repeatedly, you might not know that it was suffering. All you would be able to feel is a difference in the way your body is being treated. He scooted his knife closer to her eyeball by the slightest bit more. It truly is a shame that you could have never been relieved of sight earlier. This might not hurt so much if that was the case. But, sadly, not all of us can be the lucky ones. She whimpered as she felt the finish of the words. Time freezes underneath her fingernails, just as those words had been roughly transcribed onto the wooden table Ruby was bound to. Kevin's movement came to an abrupt halt. He stared at her, with his sickening smile unwillingly stuck in that same position, knife placed in perfect stillness on her cheek. There was no signs of him breathing. Even the warmth that the presence of a living being gave off was undetectable. He couldn't have been more unmoving. She let out a sigh and ignored the pain of tracing the knife back along its previous path to move her head out from under it, trying to push his hand away with her cranium. It was then she tried to see exactly what her bonds were, to figure out a plan. Ruby was cocooned in a skin-tight rope, nearly impossible to wriggle out of unless she suddenly fancied herself to be a master escape artist. Her hands, obviously, were unbound, but that wouldn't do much for her, aside from the advantage that had already been demonstrated. She looked around, feeling around her hand for how much free space she had before starting to scratch again, knowing that it wouldn't cancel out her first writings, waiting for it to take effect, so she had some room. The rope abided by the will of her magics, and after a good long while of scratching words into the table and bloodying her fingers, the space between Ruby and the ropes expanded. She moved them so she could sit up, baring her teeth at the pain of her toe and ankle, but sticking her fingers in her mouth as she looked around her and Kevin scanning the room. She was confused. Why would there be moonlight in Desert Bluffs of all places? Not that she was complaining. The darkness suited her better. As her eyes sped through the area, she confirmed that there were no familiar items that belonged to her. There were no writing utensils, nor were there any books in which she could write. Though the question as to how the moonlight was available in a land shrouded in shadows remained unanswered, Ruby realized that there were more pressing matters at hand to attend to. Finding her equipment would be the factor that would save her life, and she didn't know how long she had before her spell wore off. She needed to use what little time she had in the best way possible if she had any hope of survival. She looked closer at her heel, ignoring the state of her former toenail. She looked at the table she'd been laying on and then back around at the knife, taking it and looking out to the door before going to use it as a pencil to write the items she had in her hands before the blackout, back within arm's reach. Using the steely death in her hand, she carved writings onto the place that had once been her torture chamber. As Ruby was applying this magic to some of the rest of her sources of defense, however, she saw Kevin dart his eyes over in her direction out of the corner of her vision. His movements were drastically snail-paced, as though he was moving in slow motion, but he was still moving nonetheless. Her magic was already wearing off. She sensed the movement and waited for the items to appear, writing the time phrase to continue, while also using her literary powers to snap her ankle back into place as she held everything, knife included, and headed out of the room, glancing back at Kevin. Kevin only stared back at her intently, almost longingly, as he watched her depart from his grasp. He seemed heartbroken. Departing from the room, Ruby saw a hallway to greet her. Walls littered with blood, along with several different construction tools. Light shone brightly at the end of the corridor. It was a straight shot from here. Nothing that was on the wall was within her reach, as she was simply too short. She felt mildly taunted that more sources of self-defense were just out of her reach, but she did her best to shove aside that negative aura as she continued towards the light, the only idea of escape that she had ever found since this whole mess began. Perhaps there was a chance that she could live after all. She kept a tight hold of the knife as she stopped at the corner, turning back to the notepad to jot another item into existence, glancing to Kevin. She saw the hellish man who was suddenly at the end of the hallway, his gaze alone almost pitting her where she was at with an abhorrent glare. For the first time, he sounded genuinely livid. "Ruby!" he shouted. "I'm not going to play with you anymore!" He began to sprint down the hallway, rapidly approaching her, hammer in hand. His footsteps were thundering, not the usual soft sound that they made whenever he was walking, running as he was now. He sounded like a freight train. Her eyes widened, and she quickly wrote a thick brick wall into existence between her and Kevin, glancing around at the corner as the connection had not yet been made. Outside the corner was an endless sea of skies, clouds below her. The moon glowed eerily above her, and the clouds below her formed so closely together that any signs of the ground even existed had been completely disposed of. Ruby knew that she couldn't jump down from this distance, nor could she go back to face Kevin due to the barrier that she had formulated. She trapped herself. Kevin furiously slammed his hammer into the wall, creating a large hole. "Were you trying to get away from me? Why would you ever want to leave?" The hole was enlarged as his hammer impacted against the gargantuan mass of bricks. Kevin stuck a leg through the hole and stuck his head under so he didn't bump it against the roof of the entryway before his other leg followed. She glanced back to him as she ran for the edge, riding hurriedly into the clouds, feeling her shirt twitch and her shoulder blades mutate and stretch with the growth of newly formed wings. Now was as good a time to learn as any as how to use these. Kevin then discovered, as he watched her fly, where she got her powers from. At last, the confusion had been cleared. She was an angel, overflowing with a newfound desire to ensnare her and to kill her by whatever means that were available. Kevin leaped off the magically lifted room as well. He felt the wind against his face, the powerful breeze rippling his clothing, but he did not let nature alter his desired course. The psychopath fell from above and grabbed a hold of one of Ruby's wings as he did so, hammer in his other hand. Kevin smiled madly as he enthused above the roaring sounds of the winds. "If this is the end in the glorious splat, then the both of us shall let our innards intertwine as our bodies explode once we collide with the earth." Without any hesitation, he began to beat Ruby with his hammer as it plummeted towards the ground, rushing through the thick clouds. She held up her arms to hold back his blows as she tried to right, changing the appearance of her free wing into a bat's wing, swinging the finger of it into one of his eye sockets, and attempting to throw him off her. He was stubborn and wouldn't loosen his grip, despite the pain that pierced through his skull as he felt the wing cut through his eye. Blood dripped down his face, but his smile did not falter. He began cackling out of twisted merriment, swinging at her wing to break it. He let go, only for a split second, to fall only slightly, so he could grab on her disfigured foot. He swung his burly metallic hammer upwards at her wrist, which he could easily do due to the shortness of her height. She grit her teeth and tried to continue flying, slashing the knife at his hand. Blood spilt and dripped down through the air. Kevin howled in laughter through his pain as he felt the blade penetrate his flesh. As if to return the favor, he slammed his hammer onto her hand, causing her to grunt in agony. The impact knocked the book out of her hand, sending it flying unpredictably through the sky, just as his blood. If this was meant to be a game of who could be rid of their opponent's weapons first, he would have won. As they continued to rapidly descend, the ground became more and more visible, unearthly amounts of sand presenting itself at last. Kevin began to crawl up at Ruby's body as he screamed, "Look around you! Strex!" Another blow of his hammer, this time across her face. She whined in pain. "Look inside you! Strex!" Another strike, bruising her features to the point of being flamboyantly blue. Ruby bared her teeth and did her best to refrain a scream of pain, desperately whining. "Go to sleep! Strex!" The pattern continued throughout the familiar phrase as his radio show. "Believe in a smiling God." They were fearfully close to the ground by this point. If Ruby didn't do something to get Kevin off of her soon, then the psychopath would have his wish of the two of them dying together fulfilled. Strexcorp! It is everything! She grit her teeth and managed to see enough to slash at Kevin's throat, trying to turn and throw him off so she could fly again.
Submit your damn god!
Kevin managed to dodge the slice to his throat and avoid instantaneous death. but violently flew off in her figure as he fell down to the ground from the shaking, his laughter loud and mad, not stopping. He held both of his arms out as he embraced the fate that would await him. Death, eternal darkness would be his only future, and he was willing to accept it with literally open arms. While it was true that he didn't end Ruby's life as he would have wished, he did at least manage to claim one soul of an angel. That was more than he could have asked for. Thud. A shockwave of dust covered Kevin's body. He was no longer visible. The monster, at long last, had been vanquished. She turned away from where she'd seen him fall and flew in the direction of which she considered to be her home for the past couple of years, knife still in hand, trying not to let the situation she'd endured overwhelm her. She'd get rid of her wings as soon as she was back. After an hour or so, she finally landed by the apartment and wrote in the sand to get rid of the wings before she made her way into the house, greeting her adopted parents and letting her wounds be tended to, as she told them of the events she had endured. Later that night, she promised to herself in bed, under the duvet, that she would keep to being the town's angel in place of the one who had saved her. Strex would not win.